Imagine a man who can't form new memories. He remembers everything by writing it down in a diary. A man like that works at a bank. He joins a robbery plan. Whether the heist succeeds or not, you'll find out at the end. The story begins on a quiet summer night. Chris is driving down an empty road. His girlfriend is sitting beside him, while two of her friends are in the back seat. It was their farewell party that night, and everyone was having fun. But Chris wanted to make the night even more unforgettable. He turns off the headlights and opens the roof so he can watch the fireflies more closely, really take in the beauty of the moment. But his friends start getting nervous. "Come on, man, turn the lights back on. This is dangerous." After hearing them beg again and again, Chris finally switches the headlights back on. But by then, it was already too late. Even though he tries to avoid it, the car crashes straight into a harvester. For years have passed, but for them, the world still hasn't moved on. To these people, it feels like the accident happened only yesterday. Chris and his girlfriend survived the crash. But the two friends sitting in the back seat weren't so lucky. They died in the accident. The guilt from that night eats away at Chris every single day. But even if he wants to escape it, he can't. The accident changed him too. He gets angry for no clear reason. And worst of all, his mind can no longer store new memories. That's why he's forced to live through a diary, writing down every important thing. Every morning, he wakes up, and writes instructions to himself. He started looking at life differently now. Whatever came to his mind, he said it openly. If he liked a girl, he'd just tell her directly. He even started taking classes to learn how to live with his condition. But honestly, even that turned out to be extremely difficult for him. Later, he realized he'd locked the car and left the keys inside. But this had happened so many times before that he had already started hiding a spare key inside his shoe. Carrying a heavy sense of regret, Chris went to see his ex-girlfriend, Kelly. She lost one of her legs in the accident and now walks with a prosthetic leg. After that, Chris returned home. His blind roommate, Louisa, had left him a voice note with instructions for making dinner. But while cooking, Chris couldn't open a box. The frustration instantly got to him. He lost his temper and started throwing things around. Chris called Louisa, and Louisa quickly wrapped up what he was doing and came home to help his friend. Chris apologized for the mess he'd made. Louisa started preparing dinner while casually talking with Chris. Later that night, Chris went to the bank where he worked as a janitor. He wanted to become a clerk, but his boss, Mr. Turtle, shut the idea down immediately. Even while working, Chris would mess around with the mop, drifting into memories of a life that now felt impossibly far away. That's when it's revealed that before the accident, Chris had been doing really well in life. Chris used to be a hockey player, someone people had huge expectations from. But that accident took everything away from him. Chris kept working. While he was cleaning the bank, a car suddenly pulled up outside. A guy sitting inside kept staring at him. Within seconds, Chris recognized him. It was Gary, an old friend from school. But seeing Chris working as a janitor clearly hit Gary hard. After that, he quietly told the people with him to move ahead with the plan. Later, Chris went to a bar and tried talking to the woman sitting next to him. But he struggled to keep the conversation going. He didn't even know what to ask next. Just then, Gary walked in. The woman immediately started smiling and laughing at Gary's confident charm, and Chris quietly began taking notes. But Gary stopped him. "I went to school with your sister," he said. A little later, the bartender tried taking advantage of Chris. Because of his memory condition, Chris accidentally paid for the same thing twice. But Gary stepped in and forced the bartender to give Chris his money back. Gary was handsome, confident, the kind of person Chris himself used to be before the accident. As they talked, Gary pulled an asthma inhaler from his pocket. Even with asthma, he carried himself like nothing in the world could slow him down. Gary asked Chris about the accident, and Chris told him everything. Instead of pitying him, Gary encouraged him. Gary told him, when life takes something away with one hand, it gives something back with the other. Chris found himself deeply affected by Gary's words. A little later, Chris and Louisa went to his family's luxurious house. Everyone in the family was wealthy, except Chris. Even his own parents looked down on him. They kept asking pointed questions about his job and his situation, knowing it would make him feel small and out of place. During dinner, Louis accidentally mentioned his idea for opening a restaurant. But the family treated it like a joke. They didn't believe Chris was capable of handling any real responsibility. Louis quietly sank into thought. Later, he told Chris, "Look, don't get mad, but I need to say something." Chris replied, "I won't." So Louis finally said it. "For your own good. I don't think you should keep going back there. They don't really see you as one of them anymore." Chris stayed quiet because deep down, he knew Louis was right. At work, Chris also had a friend named Tad, a police officer. Tad would often stop by during Chris's night shift and bring him something sweet. They'd talk for a bit, then Tad would head out again. The next night, Chris went back to the bar and tried using Gary's pickup lines on another woman. He forced himself to act completely confident. But the woman immediately disliked the way he was talking. Seeing Chris completely embarrassed, a girl named Lovely walked over to him. At Gary's request, she took a photo with Chris. She even bought him a drink. Then she asked, "So, what do you do?" Chris hesitated for a moment before answering. He clearly felt uncomfortable talking about his job. He also kept forgetting her name, so Lovely smiled and wrote it down for him so he wouldn't forget it again. Soon, Gary and his girlfriend joined them, and later Gary drove everyone back to his place. There, Gary and his girlfriend disappeared into the bedroom and started making out. Meanwhile, Chris and Lovely were left alone in another room. Lovely looked at him and said, "I used to watch you play hockey. I had a crush on you for years." She started talking about all the stories she'd heard about him back then, how he used to be the guy everyone admired. As they kept talking, the two of them grew surprisingly close. Later that night, Gary dropped Chris off at home. Before leaving, Gary asked him, "Your dad's rich, right? So why are you living in a place like this?" Chris simply replied, "I don't care." Then Gary invited him to a party. Just then, another car arrived to pick Gary up. As he got in, he looked at Chris and said, "Man, you can do way better than this. This miserable life doesn't suit you." Chris walked inside the house, but he couldn't avoid Louis noticing the way he came home that night. Louis immediately noticed the smell of alcohol and women's perfume on Chris. But instead of getting upset, he was genuinely happy that Chris had finally gone out and enjoyed himself for once. Then he started asking questions. "So what happened? Come on, tell me the truth." After hearing the full story, Louis found the whole situation a little strange. A few days later, Chris went with Gary and Lovely to a farmhouse. When Chris asked whose farmhouse it was, nobody gave him a straight answer. They were still talking when an extremely old man suddenly appeared. Looking at everyone suspiciously, the man asked, "Who are these people?" Gary, with his intimidating presence, calmly told Uncle Bonnie to take the old man away and look after him. That moment made Chris even more suspicious that something serious was going on. Later that night, Chris woke up and realized everyone else was gone. He started searching for them and eventually found them all gathered in the basement. Photos were pinned across the wall. There was a map of the area, security details, and even a picture of Chris himself. Then Gary finally revealed the truth. "The bank where you work, we're planning to rob it." Chris immediately replied, "Poor farmers keep their money there. Why rob innocent people?" Gary answered, "The real money doesn't belong to poor farmers. It belongs to the big agricultural corporations." The crops had just been sold, which meant the bank would be holding a huge amount of cash. Gary was incredibly persuasive. The way he talked made it sound like stealing from people like that was almost their right. Chris still looked uncertain. "I don't know, man, this doesn't feel right." Gary calmly replied, "Nothing in this world is fair. The people with money are the ones with power." Then he looked directly at Chris. "What do you think would happen if you asked your father for money tomorrow? He'd hand it over without a second thought. Guys like us don't have that luxury. You were broke before, and you're still broke now." Those words clearly got under Chris's skin. His mood darkened, and he started to leave. But before he could go, Lovely stopped him, and the two of them spent the night together. The next morning, while Chris was leaving, he noticed Gary and Lovely watching him together from the window. At that moment, it became obvious that Lovely was involved with Gary too. That same day, Chris and Louis met with the bank manager to pitch their restaurant idea and ask for a loan. But the manager immediately pointed out that neither of them had ever run a restaurant before. To him, they were inexperienced people jumping into something they didn't understand. So he bluntly told them, the bank can't approve your loan. He also explained that their proposed budget was far too small to realistically make the business work. Still, after a lot of convincing, the manager finally said, "I'll think about it." Louis could already tell that, "I'll think about it," probably meant no. But Chris barely paid attention. He quietly kept talking to Kelly instead. Chris kept finding himself staring at Kelly. Deep down, he still couldn't move on from losing her. As the days passed, his frustration only grew stronger. That night, Chris decided to test Gary's advice. He called his father and said, "I need about $10,000. For a moment, there was silence. Then Chris explained that he wanted to start a small business and needed the money to make it happen. But his father refused. Chris tried again. "Fine, just lend me part of it. I'll figure out the rest." Even then, his father still said no. What hurt Chris the most was knowing his father was wealthy enough that giving him that amount would have meant nothing. Instead, his father only asked, "Are you in some kind of trouble? Do you need to come back home?" By now, Chris was already furious. To him, it felt like he was begging for scraps. So he coldly refused the offer and hung up the phone. His father's rejection hit him hard. That was the moment Chris decided to join Gary and the others in robbing the bank. In his mind, it felt like the only way out of poverty, the only open door left for him. And more than anything, he wanted to prove to his family that he could still accomplish something on his own. After that, Chris began actively helping the gang prepare for the robbery. He even took photos of the bank vault so they could figure out how to break into it. Gary told Chris, "The second the money arrives at the bank, you let us know. The robbery has to happen that same night." Then he added, "And your only job is to make sure your friend, Deputy Tad, doesn't show up during the robbery. He comes around at random times, so we can't predict him." That night, Lovely stayed over at Chris's house. After Chris fell asleep, she went to the kitchen to grab something from the fridge, but Louis was still awake. Louis felt like this was the perfect chance to finally talk to her. He asked her directly, "What exactly are you doing with Chris?" He clearly wasn't ready to believe that Lovely genuinely cared about him. Then Louis started opening up about his own past. He explained how he once fell in with the wrong crowd and eventually got involved in making drugs inside a house. What he didn't realize at the time was how much toxic gas the process released. That's how he lost his eyesight. He wasn't born blind. Lovely immediately became defensive. "No, I love Chris. How can you even say that? Why do you think I'm using him?" But Louis answered bluntly, "I'm not going to let the same thing that happened to me happen to Chris." Chris overheard the entire argument, but stayed silent. The truth was, he honestly didn't know who was right and who was wrong anymore. A few days later, Tad stopped by the bank again to bring Chris some donuts. But Chris was intentionally acting cold toward Tad. He wanted Tad to get upset with him and stop showing up at the bank on the night of the robbery. Tad handed him donuts, but Chris snapped back. "What is this supposed to be? Charity? You donating donuts to me now?" Tad quickly replied, "No, man, it's not like that." But Chris was already angry, and he walked away. Later that day, Chris and Louis were eating at a restaurant. As usual, Chris started flirting with the waitress. Louis laughed awkwardly and said, "What's gotten into you lately? You embarrass me everywhere we go." Chris had become increasingly short-tempered these days, and the comment irritated him. He replied, "Relax. You won't have to live with me much longer. In a few days, I'll have my own apartment." Instead of feeling happy for him, Louis looked uneasy after hearing that. Later, we see Lovely sitting in the back seat of a cab, waiting to see Chris one last time before leaving. Before Chris finished work that day, his boss, Mr. Tuttle, approached him. "I appreciate how hard you've been working," he told him. "Honestly, I'm impressed. I wanted to see if you'd keep trying even after being rejected." Then he smiled. "After the holidays, you'll officially start working as a clerk. And don't worry, the pay will be better too." Chris didn't even know how to react to the news. He quietly told Lovely about it afterward. The first person Chris called was Louis. At first, Louis thought something must have gone wrong at the house. But Chris quickly told him, "I'm at the bank." Before he could explain anything else, Uncle Bonnie arrived with the others. It was time for the robbery. Chris told them he had changed his mind. He tried desperately to convince them to leave. "Just go. I won't say anything. Please, just walk away." But Gary hit him hard in the stomach. "It's happening today," Gary said. "It's too late now. All the planning was already done. They were there. There was no turning back." The robbery began. After cutting the camera cables, the group broke into the safe. They started loading the money. Then suddenly, Tad showed up. In that moment, Gary pointed a gun at Chris and ordered him to act normal. "If you mess this up, you're dead." Tad greeted Chris casually. "Hey man, today's my last shift. After this, I'm transferring out." Chris forced himself to act normal, even smiling through the tension. Tad continued, "My wife is about to have a baby, so I need to get going soon." Relief washed over Chris. He quickly replied, "Hey, bro, take care. Be safe out there." Then he hesitated and added something awkwardly, clearly trying to act natural. "Sorry for earlier, about how I spoke to you." Tad just smiled. "It's all right. I know you lose your temper sometimes." And then he left. Chris stood frozen for a moment, then watched as the money was finally taken from the safe and loaded into the vehicle. For a brief second, it almost felt like everything had gone exactly as planned. Everything went smoothly. But then, Tad returned with a donut for his friend. Everyone was surprised to see him again. And when no one else appeared, Tad became suspicious. He saw Gary's shadow reflected in the glass window. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Tad immediately shot 2 members of the gang. He wounded Gary. Then, as he moved closer to arrest Gary, Chris yelled at him to look behind. But Tad kept his eyes on Gary. And that's when Bonnie fired a short gun right into Tad's back. Gary told his uncle, "Finish the cop off." And Bonnie did exactly that. Meanwhile, Chris stole the car that was carrying all the money. He tried to escape, but the memories of the accident started haunting him again. He was driving with his headlights off, without even realizing it. A police officer stopped him. But the officer checked and saw that the headlight was simply broken. Then he checked Chris's card. That's when he learned about Chris's illness. Everything was written right there. Seeing that, the police officer said, "Just go straight from here. Go home and take it easy." A little while later, Chris stopped the car on a dark, empty road. He opened the trunk. It was full of money. There was also a shovel, and cement. After finishing his work, Chris went back home. But as he approached, he noticed the lights were on. He called his friend and realized, he wasn't alone. Gary was inside, waiting. And that's when everything changed. Gary threatened Chris. "If you don't pay us, we'll kill Louis." But Chris reminded him of something important. "I have the money. And that means I have the power. If I see even the slightest scratch on Louis, you can forget about the money. I'll kill you both." Chris told Gary, "I'll give you the location. You get there." Then Chris looked at his diary. He started planning how to kill Gary and Bonnie in order to save Louis. He went to his parents' house, took his father's gun, and hid it inside a bag full of money. Then Chris fell asleep. And in his dream, he was talking to Kelly. She had forgiven him. She said, "I've moved on from the accident. You should move on too." Suddenly, Uncle Bonnie found him. He started demanding money. "Where is it?" But Chris said, "I don't remember." Then Gary pulled out Chris's diary. He realized Chris had buried the money on the same street where his father's accident had happened. Gary and Bonnie tried to force him to dig up the money. But when Chris saw the shoelaces on the bag, he immediately remembered his plan. Bonnie grabbed one bag and left, telling Chris to get the other one. But Chris had put a gun inside that bag. He grabbed it. And then, Chris shot Bonnie. To save his friend, and to save his own life. Gary was still wounded from the night of the robbery. And now, it was just Chris and Gary. He was in no condition to fight them. He collapsed, and Chris quickly grabbed his asthma pump. Gary couldn't breathe, and he died from an asthma attack. After that, Chris returned the money to the bank and reported everything to the police. But the FBI couldn't believe that someone with his condition could plan something like this. On top of that, the thieves had made a mistake. They cut the telephone wire instead of the camera line, which meant everything had been recorded. The footage clearly showed that Chris had been forced into it. They realized he had been pressured and threatened the entire time, even beaten and dragged into the plan against his will. Chris was taken in for questioning, but eventually the truth came out. After that, Chris took a loan from Mr. Tuttle, and even helped cover all the damage and losses. Still, Mr. Tuttle believed in him. Some time later, Chris opened his own restaurant with Louis. Slowly, his life and his temperament began to change for the better. Chris's father and Mr. Tuttle became regular visitors at his restaurant. Chris also started skating again, holding on to hope that maybe one day Kelly would forgive him. And maybe, they could even start over again. That if you enjoyed the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.